Well, good afternoon, and wonderful to see you wherever you may be from our beautiful refurbished auditorium. I trust the summer has been restful and enjoyable. Today's reading recounts a continuation of my adventures in Europe from 60 years ago, in the summer of 1963. I had graduated from college that June and had been married for 6 months to my first wife, who appears in the narrative as M. My last reading recounted a month spent on the Greek island of Paros. This chapter includes some very first impressions of Europe and then recounts arriving in Rome after Greece with the goal of seeing if I could somehow live there. So, welcome to La Dolce Vita, the sweet life. My second week in Europe, after a series of cold, gray, rainy days in Paris, we left on the overnight train to Milan, where a little Fiat 600 awaited us. Crossing into Italy at daybreak, the train stopped at Domodossola, a small town at the foot of the Alps, to allow for passport control by border guards with guns and dogs, decades before the freedoms conferred by the European Union. Barely awake and fumbling for my passport, I saw, glowing in soft shafts through the window shades of the couchette, the most beautiful golden sunlight I had ever known. I tear up as I write this, re-experiencing it. It was just a moment of surprise that faded into the bustle of subsequent morning preparations of converting the 6 sleeping shelves back into European second-class railroad cabin of 6 seats. Before long, the train slowed, rattling over switches as it entered the main station in Milan, which in contrast to those lovely waking moments loomed gray and industrial, the promise of seeing Da Vinci's Last Supper notwithstanding. Fortunately, it was early June and not a winter month, when thick fog hangs day after endless day over the city, and the Milanese citizens seek solace in fashion, coffee, and wine. Happily, the little Fiat was waiting for us at the company's headquarters. Signing the necessary documents requiring export from Italy after a year, I accepted the keys to this sand-colored, round-backed vehicle, which looked like a post-war American Plymouth left too long in the dryer, but new and fresh and shiny nonetheless. Having paid our respects to Da Vinci's depiction of the fateful Passover supper in the looming black Duomo, we made our way out to the autostrada, which would take us eventually across northern Italy to Venice. In true Italian spirit, evocative names are given to their turnpikes, such as l'Autostrada del Sole, from Rome to Naples, and La Serenissima. During its centuries of glory, Venice was known as the most serene, Serenissima, republic. And this autostrada runs from Milan to the enchanted cities of canals, bridges, gondolas, cathedrals, sparkling Lambrusco wine, Vivaldi, the ghetto, Tintoretto paintings, and pots of hot polenta. That afternoon, careful not to drive more than 45 miles an hour in order to allow the engine to run in for the first 500 kilometers, we turned off the highway to stretch our legs in a park on the shore of Lago de Garda, the less famous but still beautiful sister of Lake Como, with villas overlooking the water, surrounded by cypress trees and flowering gardens, gracing terraces ringed by marble balustrade, whose waterside towns are served by steam-driven ferry boats. Walking the shore in the pleasant sunshine, I followed a row of large rocks that led like a foundation of a half-built bridge out into the water. Finding a perch on a high glacial boulder above the gently lapping waves, I watched this family stroll the shoreline, children's laughing and running, adults calling out to them to be careful, visitors picnicking on cold spaghetti and prosciutto. As I sat there, the sky grew gradually brighter, and the noise of the children and tourists dimmed. Then everywhere was just silence and glowing brightness. Before I had fully grasped these changes, what seemed like a body several times larger than mine sailed above me, just touching the back of my head with its wing before rising and disappearing into the glow of the sky. Then the sounds of the park returned, and the brightness faded to a pleasant afternoon hue. I can still feel the brush of its wings, soft as a lover's touch, as if a bodhisattva, an angel, were extending a personal welcome to the charmed Italian peninsula. Nor was this my first mystical experience of Italy. As a boy, I had a recurrent dream of being a Jewish slave attached to an oar in the lowest tier of a Roman trireme warship. So that when, in the back pages of the magazine Popular Mechanics, I read the question, "Have you lived before?" along with an invitation to send my name to the Rosicrucians, I had no hesitation. Things were a little less simple one Saturday morning months later when my mother answered the front door to find a small group of earnest folk carrying pamphlets and asking to speak with, quote, Mr. James Lichtenberg. Oops. Realizing their expectations did not match the reality of the 10-year-old in front of them, they said goodbye politely. Like the great queen whom she occasionally resembled, Mom was not amused. Similarly, unlike the French I took in high school, which I actually had to study in order to learn it, Latin, first encountered in junior high, felt like something I was remembering, and the work, such as it was that merely of recollection. No surprise then, during my first touristic pass through the Eternal City at the height of that first European summer, I was astonished at how familiar certain streets and buildings appeared to be. Turning a corner of a narrow street, finding myself suddenly in a remembered piazza, or confronted by the remnants of a Roman archway, or even just a wall of ancient Roman stones, I burst into tears, overwhelmed by the sense of familiarity of this place and time, the sense of homecoming. Although we spent the first night as guests in a villa owned by some friends of M's parents, I no longer remember what sightseeing we might have done in Venice, other than a lunch on the terrace of the Excelsior Hotel on the Venice Lido, that is beach, and a first taste of vitello tonato, delicately pounded veal cutlet with a light tuna sauce, overlooking the great slate gray waves of the Adriatic. In gracious spirit, Rome greeted us, newly arrived from a month on the Greek island, with sunny days and cool, pleasant nights, whose pastime soon became people-watching at a sidewalk table at one of the famous Dolce Vita cafes of the Via Veneto. I, of course, was hoping that the golden gods of Italy's post-World War II cinema, thunder-wielding Federico Fellini, gray-eyed Giulietta Massina, lyre-bearing Marcello Mastroianni, or sea-born Sophia Loren, whom I did actually meet a couple years later, might appear. They never did. But as the evening breeze from the mountains cooled us, luxury cars cruised the roadway beside the broad sidewalk with its awnings and tables, where waiters took orders and zipped in and out of cafe doorways, while women in elegant scarves, thigh-slit dresses, and high heels stepped from those sensuous mid-century vehicles, greeted with unfailing ceremony by the busy waiters who whisked them to their reserved tables. We spent the first couple of nights in an unremarkable pensione, but the hopes of a more permanent situation, we rented an apartment, un attico, on the top floor, in a 4-story building on the steep hillside of a street in the historical center called Via Capo le Case. Though casa, singular, normally means house, in this case the plural, case, means brothels. The short street had been named for a row of public bordellos located thereon. Not altogether unlike our own 19th century Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., linking the White House and the Capitol which was then a sink of crime, debauchery, and murder. Many months later, a couple of my work colleagues recounted doing their high school homework in the parlors of similar establishments, drawing straws to see who was the lucky ragazzo to go upstairs with one of the young ladies of easy virtue. The case along Via Capole Case, legal until after the war, were just a short walk from the marble waterfall of the ever-so-famous Spanish Steps. With her sharp alto voice and voluptuous, artfully revealed Southern Italian body, our landlady might well have been a madam who inherited the building after her business was officially shuttered. Perhaps not totally shuttered, at least judging from the young priest who rang the doorbell looking for Veronica. M explained that there was no longer a Veronica and that he should be ashamed of himself. In a burst of vivid discomfiture, apologizing and crossing himself, he raced down the stairs crying, "Grazie, signora, grazie," and disappeared into the mid-afternoon traffic. Just a small instance of the unexpected and ever-present contradictions of this amazing society. A few days later, during an early autumn thunderstorm, we discovered, why is the couch wet? A leak in the living room ceiling. Our landlady was most responsive, and the next afternoon, once the roof had dried in the Roman sun, I followed her up the stairway and out onto the rooftop. Like a jump cut in a film, as I exited the low, narrow doorway, there suddenly spread out before me a grand vista of Roma, Caput Mundi, center of the world, spreading west across rooftops, churches, bell towers, with a glimmer of the languid flowing Tiber, and beyond it St. Peter's and the Vatican City, all glowing in the afternoon warm sunlight. Recovering from the panorama, I saw that Madame had brought with her a bottle of olive oil, a couple of rags and brushes, and a small can of liquid asphalt. Keeping up a friendly chatter, most of which my Italian was still not good enough to follow, in retrospect, probably in Roman dialect called Romanaccio, i.e. naughty Roman, which is a delight in its economy of expression, sly humor, and musicality. She knelt down, hiking her skirt and exposing her leg, and poured olive oil on the leak, rubbed the rooftop clean of old asphalt, surprisingly softened by the olive oil, dried off the offending patch with a clean towel, and painted on fresh asphalt from the little can. Pleased with her work, she smiled and proclaimed to me in her warm, throaty voice, "Va bene così." That should do it. As we descended the narrow stairway, she assured me that the weather would be good for the next few days and the patch would dry and we would not be further disturbed. Nor were we for the few months we lived there. So this next section is called Friends. The next unexpected visitor to our apartment was a stroke of amazing good luck, a delightful young English girl, turned-up nose, straw-colored curls, porcelain skin, a previous tenant who hoped to find something she may have left behind. Whether she had or had not proved immaterial. Recently married to an Italian physicist, Penelope, and her exuberant husband, Giancarlo, became, as we would say in the digital 21st century, our besties for the full 3 years in Rome, opening the door to life as young Romans lived it, whether midnight spaghetti fests at a neighborhood restaurant high on the Janicolo Hill, the lights of the city twinkling like stars below us, or an evening stroll through the inner city to admire the 4 river fountains in the Piazza Navona and the Pantheon in quiet shadows, on our way to the best, guarda Jimmy, il miglior gelato a Roma. Look, Jimmy, the best gelato store in Rome. Or trips to the countryside for a picnic in late February, or teaching us typically risque or sentimental songs about the sweet life in this amazing city in which we were now hoping to become full residents. Thanks in no small measure to the big American tanks that had rolled into town on June 5th, 1944, after months of intense fighting following the invasion in Anzio, to the enormous relief of exhausted citizens who had survived on fava beans, grass, and anything they could find to eat. As we walked arm in arm, Roman style, through the winding, dark cobblestone lanes, Giancarlo recounted, "I will never forget, Jimmy, big young GI soldiers throwing us chocolates, cigarettes, and laughing as we ran after them, cheering wildly while they rumbled past, holding on to the outside of the tanks." This is a translation of one of those risque songs that Giancarlo actually taught me. So it goes like this, and it translates from the Romanaccio. One day in Piazza della Cedra, a very pretty piazza, a young woman politely asked the priest what time it might be, to which he shrewdly answered, "Oh, my sweet dark-eyed beauty, if only this tunic were bronze and not cloth, you'd now hear me strike the hour." Forgive me, I run ahead of my story. Rome will do that. A more imminent question at that moment at the end of October, how to support the adventure in an unknown city where I barely spoke the language and knew no one. Teaching English was always a fallback, but as it was the Italian cinema that had inspired me, I decided to try to live the dream. This section is called Getting Real. An imposing, gated, and marine-guarded palazzo at the curve of the Via Veneto, the American Embassy offered a quiet library and a list of American companies with offices in the Eternal City. Italians, as I would soon discover, loved American movies, which were expertly dubbed, but more of that later. Armed with a list of addresses of some half a dozen Hollywood studios with offices in Rome, which I called at the American Embassy, and copies of a resume neatly folded in the pocket of my jacket, consisting of my not exactly relevant experience, 2 summers as an intern at the National Institutes of Health, my bachelor's degree, the Harvard Advocate Poetry Prize, and the recommendations from a scientist and a professor, I made my way from doorway to disinterested doorway. Of course, I aimed for the top, asking to speak with the managing director, which must have been a very demanding post in those years, as not one of them had even a moment to meet with me. Toward the end of what seemed to be a fruitless afternoon, I was about to look homeward, but there was one more office with a strange Italian-American name, La Cheyad, Colombia. I arrived there and asked to speak with the GM and handed my resume to the portiere, the doorman, whom I later knew very well as Aldo, waiting on the worn steps as he disappeared. Diverse small cars passed along the quiet street. Finally, Aldo reappeared, saying the GM apologizes for not being able to meet with me, but would I mind speaking with the head of the press office? Mind? Heart beating, I followed him inside and was ushered into an unimposing outer office whose windows looked out at the street I had been watching, and was asked to wait a moment. There were 3 wooden desks littered with magazines and newspapers, and at the desk closest to the door sat a woman in her late 30s, as round as she was tall, typing furiously at a large typewriter on which a little bell chimed each time she reached the end of the carriage, and in which were inserted a leather head and 2 carbon copies. Then from the inner office came a man in his 40s, brown spiky hair, rumpled jacket, tie undone, ash on his lapel from the cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, dark brown circles under his eyes, and a strong Roman nose, who approached me with hand outstretched. He smiled and said, "Good afternoon. I am Manfredo Verdini, assistente to the head of Ufficio Stampa. I take you in to see her, La Signorina Muller." A woman, I wondered. A German? Maud Muller, known to her friends and associates as Moody, stood behind her desk, ramrod straight, the daughter of a Swiss father and an Italian mother, and extended her hand, greeting me in English. My heart was pounding, my head was spinning, as I knew how unusual it was, even at that point in time, for a woman to have an executive position. My wife, M, was not even allowed to have her name on our new bank account. The gist of our discussion on that late afternoon, as I can recall, was as follows. The gentleman who did most of their translating would be leaving at the year's end, and if I could learn enough Italian, supported by my studies of Latin and reasonable French, we should talk again in a couple of months after the winter holidays. In a burst of barely controlled euphoria, I thanked Signorina Muller and Mr. Verdini profusely. Maud, smiling with an artfully applied graciousness, gave me one of her business cards to show to the box office of a movie theater so we could be her guests to see the Italian version of Lawrence of Arabia. Manfredo placed a warm hand on my shoulder. I said buonasera to the secretary and Aldo and left, walking on a cloud. We celebrated that night at a little outdoor restaurant on the Via Margutta, just up the street from where Fellini and La Giulietta lived, which then was a wonderful hidden lane tucked beneath the wall of the Borghese Gardens, lined with old studios for art restorers and furniture repair ateliers, now all become fancy hotels, where we spent an extravagant 1,000 lira, about $1.75, on a cold dinner of delicious thin crust pizza and freshest mozzarella, including a bottle of cold Frascati wine. Seated in candlelit shadows, head swimming from the Frascati, I saw the future spread itself out before me, soft and secure as a Roman cat asleep on the sun-warmed foot of an ancient Roman statue. So this section is called The Climb. I gave myself to learning Italian as few things ever before, spending all day reading newspapers, magazines, books, though literary Italian is quite different from the spoken language, going to the cinema, giving exchange lessons where the exchange was outrageously in my favor, even learning to make espresso in those funny little octagonal stovetop pots. While there is more to tell about the next few months, when January 2nd rolled around, I was ready. In a new jacket, white shirt and tie, hair razor cut in the Italian style, I presented myself to Aldo, who simply pointed the way to the office. I stepped in. There was a moment of shock before any recognition kicked in. They had completely forgotten me. My face must have looked downhearted beyond words because Manfredo almost jumped out of his chair. You wait, I go talk, you wait. And he disappeared into Maud's office. A few very drawn-out minutes later, Manfredo opened the door and invited me in. Scowling, standing behind her desk, as well-appointed sartorially as ever in white blouse, pearls, and dark blue pencil skirt, Maud shook my hand before sitting down. I was no longer breathing. The offer upon which they had just hastily agreed was as follows: a 2 weeks trial period, mostly translating Italian newspaper reviews of new releases, as well as correspondence with Columbia's offices in Paris, London, New York, and LA. Then, if things went okay, we would negotiate an actual contract. If, however, an unthinkable thought, it didn't work out, I would receive 30,000 lira, $50, for my pains. As Manfrey, his nickname, told me later, I said to her, "Look, Moody, he a nice boy, he come back. We try him out, no?" From wisps of conversations over the ensuing weeks, I also learned that Harvard's reputation had preceded me, hence our original conversation. More importantly, their translator had suddenly departed rather earlier than projected, so that they were, to my good fortune, a bit over a barrel. This was, after all, mid-20th century Europe, and English was decades away from being the lingua franca it has since become. Nonetheless, I was aware, as I said to doubtful Maud, of the enormous opportunity she was giving me. She nodded her head thoughtfully, clearly putting me on notice that there was no promise yet of continuance, adding in English as we said goodbye for the moment, "Good, I'm glad you